The problem of evil has been a common challenge for believers throughout the history of the church, and we hear it more now than before. Part of the reason for that is how fast news travels across the globe through the media, but I believe it is also because of our culturally ingrained memory of the great wars of our past. What we see today is a greater awareness of the fallen state of our world, of the absence of good in what we call evil. But the ancients also had an awareness of what we rightly call evil. It's a universal experience that spans thousands of years ever since the fall of man. Arjuna, for example, the Hindu warrior in the Bhagavad Gita, wrestled with the evil that plagues humanity by asking the following. He asks, if we killed these murderers, evil like theirs would cling to us. Even if they, mastered by greed, are blind to the consequences of the family's destruction, of friendships lost to treachery, how are we not to comprehend that we must turn back from evil? There's no debate that evil exists, and we can understand it as completely void of goodness. The challenge that has faced Christians has been, how do we reconcile the reality of evil with a good and loving God, as we read in the Bible? It was the Greek philosopher Epicurus, after all, who said, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" Now, atheists and skeptics have since echoed the same argument, and to this day, many think that the challenge before us is a philosophical one. I would argue strongly against that. What we're faced with is not a philosophical problem, but one that is psychological when you take everything into account. Consider this. If an innocent person were to suddenly be killed on the street by just some random shooter or passerby, even the staunchest of atheists would decry that as an evil act. He would take that evil very seriously. And that is an important fact of our reality, because it means that he is using some standard by which to determine what is good and evil. There has to be something that differentiates between the two. He does not regard evil as something purely philosophical or preferential, but rather as something objective that cannot be called good. But what is that standard by which he differentiates good and evil? It can only be God, the lawgiver. You see, the skeptic might want to believe that the reality of evil is a solid philosophical challenge against the God of the Bible. But by referring to the reality of evil, what he does instead is reveal his own contradiction, because what he refers to as evil can only be rightfully called evil from within the Christian worldview. He cannot then make sense of his own revulsion to evil when he denies the God of the Bible. He betrays what he claims to believe. And so in many ways, he's the sort of a walking and talking contradiction. However, as a Christian, I can make perfect sense of my revulsion to evil, because my standard is found in the absolute, unchanging, and good character of God. Here then is my response to the apparent philosophical problem. The challenge of the unbeliever is that God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil exists. The Bible teaches all this to be true. So the contradiction must appear evident to us, right? No, not at all. On the contrary, what we see instead is a psychological problem. Because if we adopt what the Bible teaches, that God is all good, that God is all powerful, and that evil exists, then we must close with the following. God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil which exists. God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil which exists. What might be a biblical example of this? Well, we can consider the crucifixion of Jesus. Ask yourself the question, was it evil that Jesus was killed? He lived a morally perfect life, performed signs and wonders to restore that which was broken, sick, and dead. He was the holiest of holies, the holiest of all men, because he is the Holy of Holies, the second person of the triune Godhead, eternally begotten of the Father and of the same substance as God. His teachings exposed the false teachings of the religious authorities of his day. And it was out of jealousy for both his influence and authority that he was killed. Now, was the killing of Christ evil? Yes, it was a great evil, in fact. An innocent man, innocent before God on all accounts, was given a criminal's death. The bodily manifestation of God was abused by fallen, sinful man. But God had a morally sufficient reason for that evil. It was for the redemption, salvation, and renewal of man in creation. That by the death of Christ, he might serve as a substitution for the penalty, for the payment of our penalty of sin, our violation of God's law, for all those who believe. The problem, as you can see, is that the reality of evil is not philosophical. No, it's psychological. Because the truth is, we might be able to see the coherence of the Christian worldview, how it corresponds to reality, how we can make sense of reality from the lens of Scripture, but we emotionally struggle to accept the reality of evil. We emotionally struggle with that. The biblical book of Job, for example, presents us with a godly man who is blessed with a large family, good health, and financial prosperity. But he suddenly loses everything, and I mean everything. Throughout the book, God does not provide an explanation to Job as to why he is allowed to suffer such things. As it concerns the direct answer, well, Job isn't given one. He is, however, given a vast tour of the many created wonders of God by God himself, and he explores the great complexity of God's creation under his divine sovereignty. Job arrives at the realization that finite man cannot fully comprehend the ways of the infinite God. For what we see in part, God sees in full. How then do we respond to the challenge of evil when we are faced with it? With faith in God, for he is still good and he is still sovereign. And when we see others faced with the reality of evil, let us be sensitive and respond in such a way that we are ministering firstly to the heart of the person and not just the mind.